What would you do if a wild predator became a mother to three helpless puppies? At the Pacific Crest Wildlife Rescue Center, a grieving bobcat named Shadow had lost her entire litter. She was fierce, unpredictable, and dangerous, until the day three abandoned Labrador puppies arrived. When their tiny cries echoed through the center, Shadow did something no one expected. What followed was a story that blurred the line between wild and domestic, and left even scientists questioning everything they thought they knew. Stay with me, because this true story will shock you. And before we begin, let me ask, do you believe animals can form bonds across species? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible rescue stories. Under the muted gray light of a Pacific Northwest morning, the world felt heavy and silent. At the far edge of the Pacific Crest Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation Center, behind double steel fencing and thick clusters of cedar and Douglas fir, Shadow prowled her enclosure. Her movements were restless, a ceaseless, aching circuit that wore a trail through last autumn's leaves. The air still held the scent of rain and the old, cold memory of something lost. Shadow was an adult female bobcat, once the pride of the center, her tawny coat dappled with darker rosettes, her green-gold eyes sharp as new glass. Not long ago, her den had been the beating heart of the rescue's hopes. After years of setbacks, she'd birthed her first litter, a clutch of tiny, perfect kittens, each one a small, wriggling miracle. Cameras hidden in the rocks had captured those first moments, her low, steady purrs, the way she curled protectively around her young, the fierce hope in her watchful gaze. But hope is fragile here. A week ago, a sudden infection swept through the den. It started with a cough, a slowing of movement, a single kitten refusing milk. Within 48 hours, all of them, every last kitten, were gone. No amount of medicine or late-night intervention could change the outcome. The den that had overflowed with life had turned empty, and in its silence, Shadow unraveled. Now, she was no longer the gentle mother the staff remembered. She tore at the walls with her claws, raked splinters from the old log where her kittens had nursed. At night, her yowls echoed down the concrete corridors, sharp and mournful. The keepers who brought her food moved quickly, wary of her sudden lunges and the unpredictable flash of teeth. On the cameras, they saw her guard the entrance to the empty den with the kind of ferocity that chilled the blood. No one, not even the senior vet, dared approach too close. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the center's director, watched all of this unfold from her office window. She saw the haunted way Shadow's shadow flickered between trees, the relentless way she circled the den, her body a taut bowstring of loss. Reed believed in science, but she also believed in grief, a force as real and relentless as hunger. She knew as she sipped her coffee that morning that they were close to losing Shadow too. For the staff, the transformation was a punch to the gut. Only weeks earlier, they'd celebrated with cake and photos, toasting Shadow's triumph, a rare success in a world where bobcat numbers dwindled year after year. Now their pride had become a ghost, unreachable, her world reduced to the boundaries of her cage and the pain she refused to release. In the long, lonely afternoons, Shadow sometimes sat with her face pressed against the wire, eyes narrowed at the horizon. She refused to eat, barely drank, and once when a keeper lingered too long, she lashed out, claws raking air, a guttural snarl rising from somewhere deep and wounded. Even the birds avoided her enclosure now. Inside the den, the smell of her kittens lingered, a faint, fading sweetness that only she could sense. Every night she returned to that empty space lying among the old towels and shredded grass, tensing at every echo, searching the darkness for movement that would never return. The center's staff tried everything: fresh game, new bedding, hours of patient waiting. But Shadow wanted nothing from them. She was no longer the miracle mother, no longer the poster child for their outreach brochures. She was grief given shape, a wild thing cornered and lashing out, her world reduced to loss and memory. As the days dragged on, rumors drifted through the center, whispers about what should be done if Shadow refused food for another week. Dr. Ben Carter, the lead veterinarian, argued for intervention, a round of sedatives and forced feeding. Others said it was time to consider the unthinkable. But Reed hesitated. She watched Shadow's restless vigil, the way her eyes flicked to every sound, and she wondered, was there anything left that could reach a heart that broken? Or was this, finally, the end of hope for them all? Night came early that week. As the first mist gathered in the pines, Shadow pressed her body to the cold floor of her dencho, her breath coming slow and thin. Outside, life at the center moved on, generators humming, radios crackling. Somewhere, a coyote yipped at the moon. But inside the enclosure, grief reigned, silent and absolute, with only the softest echo of purring in the darkness. A sound that, for the first time in weeks, no longer belonged to anyone at all. It was the third straight night of rain. Low clouds smothered the mountains and slicked the highway that wound past Pacific Crest's gates. Just after dawn, a battered pickup jolted to a stop beside the rescue center's main drive. The headlights flicked once, then cut out, leaving only the dull gold glow of the porch lamp to reveal a cardboard box by the roadside. No one saw who left it. By the time the night staff noticed, the truck was already a memory, swallowed by morning mist. Inside the box, pressed together for warmth, were 3 Labrador puppies, barely old enough to wobble on their own feet. Their fur was patchy, skin pink beneath the white and yellow. Ranger, the biggest, pushed his nose up first, nosy and unafraid. Scout, his sister, hung back, eyes wide, taking in every movement. The smallest pup, Pip, whimpered, a thin, reedy sound, tremulous and raw. It didn't take long for the center's staff to bring them in, wrapping them in old towels, checking for ticks, for fever, for any sign of the neglect that sometimes haunted these country roads. But this morning, the puppies were just cold and hungry. No collars, no tags, their whole world reduced to the shape of each other. Dr. Reed, called down from her office, looked over the trio with practiced hands, her face set but gentle. "People drop animals here all the time," one of the techs murmured. "But these ones, they're barely out of the nest." As the puppies warmed in their blankets, their cries filled the rescue's back halls, soft at first, then growing, sharp and plaintive, echoing in empty exam rooms, vibrating beneath the floorboards of the quiet center. Shadow, pacing her own enclosure on the far side of the building, froze mid-stride. Her ears twitched. Her green eyes widened and sharpened, tracking the sound through concrete and steel and rain-washed air. The puppy's whimpers sliced through her grief like a blade. Each time they cried, she stopped moving, her whole body straining toward the faint, unfamiliar voices. For the staff watching her from the monitors, it was the first time in days her rage and anguish gave way to something else, a flicker of attention, of restless, questioning focus. It didn't go unnoticed. Dr. Reed watched the screens, notebook balanced on her knee, a line forming between her brows. Every time the puppies cried, Shadow responded. Sometimes she prowled the fence line. Sometimes she pressed herself low to the ground, nose quivering, eyes hunting for something she couldn't see. And always, when the puppies quieted, Shadow sank back into that heavy, sunken posture, a storm passing, leaving only silence behind. The idea came to Dr. Reed suddenly, in a way that felt half-dreamed, half-daring. What if the puppy's cries could reach the part of Shadow that grief had not destroyed? What if, impossible as it sounded, she could become something other than a wounded predator? The center had seen unusual bonds before, but never between a bobcat and a dog, never with stakes this high. Reed shared her thought with Dr. Ben Carter over coffee in the break room. Carter's reaction was immediate and fierce. "Evelyn, you'd be throwing live bait to a grieving predator," he snapped, voice hard and raw from sleepless nights. "That's not science. That's a death sentence. We're here to protect animals, not gamble with them." He shook his head, eyes cold. "You saw what happened last week. She's not herself. She's dangerous. There's nothing left to reach." The staff gathered in hushed groups, debating ethics, risks, and what it meant to hope for something far outside nature's rules. Some argued for caution, insisting the puppies needed calm, routine, no more trauma. Others, glancing at the security monitors, couldn't help but see the faint, unspoken longing in Shadow's gaze. That night, as thunder rolled down the slopes and rain battered the center's roof, the decision was made. The puppies, for now, would stay on the opposite side of the building. But Dr. Reed spent hours by Shadow's enclosure, listening as the bobcat pressed her body to the gate. Eyes burning holes through the darkness, her muscles tensed and ready, straining toward that fragile, trembling cry. The rain fell harder, muffling the world in a hush that was almost peaceful. But inside the rescue, a storm of another kind was brewing, one of doubt and hope and 1,000 questions no one could answer. What did a mother become when she lost her children? And what did abandoned puppies become if someone, something, heard their cries? In the dim light before dawn, with the clouds pressing low and the river swollen and wild beyond the fence, the center held its breath. The empty den waited. The puppies cried. And in the shadowy places between, the possibility of something extraordinary, something that might heal what was broken, flickered for the first time, fragile as the cry of a motherless child. The morning after the storm, the rescue center awoke to a sharp, clean light. Water beaded on every leaf. Mist clung low to the grass, silvering the chain-link fences. In the exam room, the 3 puppies whimpered softly, their noses burrowing into folds of blanket that barely held the fading warmth of night. Dr. Reed stood by the window, watching the bobcat enclosure across the yard. Her mind circled the same impossible thought. What if there was a way to cross that silent gulf between a wild mother's grief and 3 orphaned pups' hope? She watched as Shadow, never still, prowled along the fence, ears perked, the restless hunger in her eyes replaced, for a moment, by a glimmer of searching. By mid-morning, the decision was made. A trial, conducted under the strictest possible controls. The veterinary team assembled in hushed tension. Trank guns were checked, cameras refocused, protocols whispered and rechecked. Every step would be documented. There would be no second chances. The staff set to work preparing the puppies. They moved quietly, almost reverently, knowing how much hung on these fragile lives. Old bedding from Shadow's den, rags and grass, torn fabric, pieces still thick with her scent, was brought to the exam room. The puppies, wriggling and uncertain, were gently rubbed down with the den-scented cloths, their own smells masked by the wild musk of the bobcat's world. "Even their heartbeats are racing," a tech whispered, holding Pip, whose whole body trembled with nerves. Scout growled softly, a warning lost in the shuffle, while Ranger wriggled, eager for the next adventure, oblivious to the risk. Outside, the enclosure was prepared. Food and water were removed, distractions cleared, Shadow paced, tail lashing, her mood unpredictable, danger humming in the air like static before lightning. At last, the moment came. The gate to the outside yard, usually reserved for medical staff, was unlocked just enough to slide the smallest of carriers inside. The puppies, still drowsy from a light sedative, hearts beating wild, were placed in a small wire-fenced pen, separated from Shadow by only a few feet and a chain-link divide. Staff crouched low behind barriers, hands poised on tranquilizer triggers. Shadow froze. The scent hit her first, a whiff of something heartbreakingly familiar, layered atop the foreign tang of puppy breath. Her ears shot up, eyes narrowed, body coiled low to the ground. She padded closer, each step slow and deliberate, the way only a wildcat stalks the unknown. The puppies bunched together, Ranger in front, Scout pressed to his side, Pip shivering at the back. Then, a sudden noise, a rock, nudged by Scout's nervous paw, startled Pip. He stumbled, lost his footing, and let out a high, sharp yelp. The sound pierced the stillness like a cry from another world. In that instant, everything changed. Shadow's hackles rose. For a breathless moment, the staff thought she might attack, the animal in her boiling to the surface. But instead, she stopped. Something in Pip's cry, a note of helplessness maybe, or the pure animal terror that echoes across species, struck a chord buried deep beneath her grief. She crouched down, nose pressed to the ground, breathing in the mingled scent of puppies and loss. Her growl faded. The pupils in her golden eyes widened, softening. She took one step forward, then another, pressing her muzzle through the chain link, close enough that her breath ruffled the fur on Pip's back. Pip didn't move. He trembled, a statue made of fear and fragile hope. But when Shadow's nose touched his fur, the little puppy whimpered once more, a sound that sounded almost like a plea. There was a long, suspended silence. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. And then, gently, so gently it barely registered at first, Shadow nudged Pip with her nose, guiding him forward, away from the other puppies, toward the warmth and safety of her den. The staff behind the glass exchanged stunned glances. Dr. Carter, his knuckles white on the tranq gun, let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Reed pressed her hand to her mouth, not daring to hope, barely trusting what she saw. Shadow sniffed each puppy in turn, her body tense but no longer hostile. She circled the wire pen once, then, with a slow, deliberate motion, settled herself beside them, her flank pressed against the fence. The puppies, uncertain, inched closer, pulled by a need they didn't understand. No one spoke. Cameras recorded every second, the hush broken only by the soft rustle of fur, the faint whimpers of the pups, the slow, measured breathing of a wildcat whose heart, just maybe, had not shut itself to hope after all. Night fell before the staff could move them. By then, Shadow was lying near the pen, her eyes half closed, her tail flicking in slow, uncertain arcs. The den behind her, once a grave, now a threshold, waited with its old, faded scent of belonging. The puppies slept in a tight, trusting knot, their tiny bodies pressed close to the fence, as if they'd found, at last, the edge of something new. For the first time since the loss, Shadow did not prowl or snarl through the night. She simply watched, and somewhere, in the hush between storm and sunrise, a boundary softened. An impossible connection flickered to life, quiet as breath, fragile as hope. The next morning, the center was steeped in a tense, vibrating quiet, as if every living thing sensed a fragile truce unfolding just out of sight. In the pale light, Shadow crouched by the chain-link fence, eyes locked on the pen where the puppies had spent the night. Her body was a stillness that threatened to snap, every muscle alert. For the staff, the hours crawled. No one dared to speak above a whisper. When the puppies woke, Scout stretched first, ears flicking, eyes scanning. Ranger yawned, bold even in sleep. Pip shivered awake, blinking against the soft chill. The gate between pens slid open by inches, enough for the puppies to step through if they dared. For a moment, none moved. Then, as if pulled by a silent thread, Ranger padded forward, Scout behind him, Pip stumbling last. Shadow watched them cross the invisible line, every instinct warring behind her gaze. She rose, circled the puppies with slow, predatory grace, her tail low, head cocked. The puppies stopped, held still. A single swat from her broad paw landed inches from Ranger's nose. A warning, precise and measured. The message was unmistakable. This was her den, her territory, her rules. The puppies, adaptable in the way only the very young can be, learned quickly. When Shadow swatted, they stilled. When she hissed low in her throat, they shrank from the boundaries she drew. There was no softness yet, only structure, a map of acceptable movement laid out in paw swipes and cold green stares. The staff watching behind the reinforced glass could see it. Shadow was not coddling these orphans. She was teaching them the cost of survival. Through the long day, the process repeated. Whenever Ranger grew too bold, Shadow blocked his way with her body. When Scout sniffed near her den entrance, Shadow delivered a warning growl, deep and resonant. Pip, ever cautious, learned to stay close to his siblings, to avoid the places where Shadow's tail flicked with irritation. Food was the first test. That afternoon, the staff discreetly slid a strip of raw meat into the enclosure, tucking it just inside the line of Shadow's space. The puppies sniffed it with confusion, whining, not understanding the wild scent. Shadow dragged the meat closer, tearing a piece free, dropping it at their feet, an offering, or perhaps a lesson. The puppies looked to one another, then to Shadow, uncertain. Pip pawed at the meat, then turned away, his nose wrinkling. Scout whined, a high, plaintive note that echoed through the den. For a long moment, Shadow stared at them, head tilted, as if puzzled by their refusal. She sniffed them, searching for an answer, but only found confusion. These creatures, so close to her own lost young, would not eat her food. Behind the glass, Dr. Reed jotted notes. Was this generosity or instinct? Shadow trying to fulfill a role her grief refused to release? Whatever the answer, it left a mark. A moment of hesitation in Shadow's severity. A glimpse of bewildered care beneath her discipline. Eventually, the staff slipped in bowls of soaked kibble and formula, placing them near the den's entrance, close enough for the puppies to reach, far enough that Shadow could still stand guard. Even then, she hovered, blocking, watching. growling low at anyone who lingered too close. She claimed the food as her own, defending it from threats real or imagined, her role as provider unyielding. As dusk settled over the center, something subtle began to shift. The puppies, exhausted from the strain of new rules, huddled together at the edge of Shadow's space. She watched them, still as stone, eyes unblinking. For a while it seemed she might never let them near. But as the sky purpled and shadows deepened, Shadow stretched, slow and deliberate, and lay down, her flank forming a wall behind the puppies, her body both barrier and shield. The staff barely dared breathe. No one expected tenderness, not yet. But in the hush of that evening, there was a new rhythm, a pattern of give and take, of boundaries drawn and slowly, inch by inch, redrawn. Night fell heavy and cold. The den, once a grave, now held new life, a family forged not by choice but by circumstance and survival. The rules were strict, the boundaries fierce, but within them, something small and stubborn began to grow. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was the first step. And for Shadow, and for the puppies pressed tight against her warmth, it was enough to carry them through the dark. Days stretched into weeks, and inside the wire-fenced world of Shadow's den, a new rhythm took hold. Each morning, the light crept in through the cedar boughs, spilling gold across the straw and dirt. The puppies, now growing steadier on their feet, awoke pressed together in a tangle of limbs and soft whimpers, still instinctively seeking the security of one another, and now, impossibly, the silent presence of the Bobcat. Shadow ruled the space with unbending discipline. She moved among the puppies as a force of nature, quick to correct, quick to remind them of their place. Yet the harshness that first marked her grief was softening, almost imperceptibly, at the edges. There were fewer swats now, fewer sharp hisses. Instead, a pattern of rough guidance began to emerge, a language of lessons written in movement and shadow. In the early hours, the den would ring with small, clumsy sounds, Ranger tumbling over his own paws as he stalked a crumpled leaf, Scout watching from the sidelines, sharp-eyed and wary, Pip trailing a few uncertain steps behind. Shadow watched it all with an intensity that bordered on study. At times, she would demonstrate, lowering her sleek body to the ground, tail twitching, shoulders rippling as she crept low, teaching the art of patience, the precision of stillness. Ranger, boldest of the three, tried to mimic her every move. He pressed his belly to the earth, squinting in concentration, his large paws splayed awkwardly. His tail, never quite silent, thumped the ground at the wrong moments, sending leaves scattering and birds flapping up from the brush. Scout, more cautious, learned to watch before she leapt. Her small head cocked, her gaze fixed, learning the pause that comes before the pounce. But Pip was different. He followed, always a heartbeat behind, his movements hesitant, his body quivering with uncertainty. Yet in the silent language of the wild, even hesitation can be a lesson. One of survival, of knowing when to hold back. Shadow's methods were not gentle, but they were deliberate. When a puppy grew too loud, she glared, ears pinned flat, a low rumble issuing from deep within her chest. If they wrestled too close to her den, she drew a line with her body. A living boundary they quickly learned not to cross. It was discipline forged from the laws of her world, where softness rarely guaranteed survival. Behind the glass, the staff watched in a mixture of awe and laughter. Ranger's clumsy attempts at stalking left the scientists shaking their heads, unable to contain smiles at the sight of a Labrador puppy imitating a bobcat's predatory crouch. Scout, with her uncanny ability to rise mid-step, drew murmurs of surprise. Look at her. She's learning the way a wildcat sees. Even Pip, once hopelessly timid, found a small courage in watching his siblings fail and try again. But the exchange was not one-sided. As the weeks passed, Shadow found herself the student as often as the teacher. Ranger, irrepressible and stubborn, insisted on dropping sticks at her feet, barking softly, demanding play. At first, she ignored him, blinking slow and unamused. But over time, as the days grew warmer and the puppies more insistent, something strange stirred inside her. The next time Ranger nudged her with a stick, she batted it aside, not with anger, but with a curious, almost playful flick. It was the start of a new game. The puppies, delighted, would dart after the stick, nipping and tumbling, urging Shadow to join. For the first time since her loss, she moved with something like lightness. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was close. The boundaries between wild and tame, grief and healing, were blurring, moment by moment. There were setbacks, of course. Sometimes Shadow's old wounds flared, and she retreated, cold and distant, for hours on end. The puppies would wait, huddled at the den's edge, eyes following her every move. But always, inevitably, she returned, drawn by some thread she could not name, to the chaotic, hopeful mess of her strange, adopted brood. The staff recorded everything, hours of footage, pages of notes. Dr. Reed wrote, "Family is not always written in blood. Sometimes it is written in the silent lessons of survival and the hesitant steps toward trust." Dr. Carter remained cautious, watching for signs that instincts might snap back the other way, that the wild could reclaim what was never truly tamed. But for now, inside the enclosure, a fragile balance held. Shadow, the wounded queen of the wild, taught the puppies how to move unseen, how to read the world through scent and silence. And in return, the puppies taught her something she had never learned. Not in the forest, not even in motherhood. The small, vital truth of play and affection. As dusk fell and the sky faded to blue, Shadow lay in the straw, the puppies curled close at her side. The center was quiet, hushed with wonder and the secret, growing hope that sometimes even the wildest hearts can learn to belong again. Late summer brought a new sharpness to the air, and with it, a subtle shift inside Shadow's world. The den had settled into its uneasy rhythm, less a family than a fragile coalition, governed by rules written on fur and instinct. Yet beneath the surface, something stranger and more unpredictable was brewing. On a sun-warmed afternoon, a squirrel found its way through a gap in the outer mesh, dropping from the cedar branches into Shadow's enclosure with the startled urgency of all small prey. Instantly, Shadow's body tensed, muscles bunching, ears flattening, every nerve alive to the hunt. But it wasn't only Shadow who reacted. Ranger, ever the boldest, had been chewing a stick nearby. At the first scuttle of claws, he stilled. The change was immediate, his playful energy giving way to something new and unfamiliar. His body lowered, tail stiff, eyes locked on the squirrel. He crept forward, silent but for the faint whisper of his paws in the grass, copying the low, deliberate crawl Shadow had demonstrated so many times. Scout hung back, ears pricked, her attention sharp as a knife's edge. Pip whimpered softly, caught between curiosity and fear. The staff watched, breath held. In the observation room, Dr. Reed scribbled furiously in her notebook, heart pounding with wonder and anxiety. But it was Dr. Broking, Carter's face, that betrayed the deeper worry. The line between pride and concern etched into his brow. He leaned toward the monitors, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see it now?" he muttered. "He's not playing. That's predation. That's a Labrador puppy with a wildcat's mind." Ranger's approach was almost perfect. He was clumsy. There was no disguising his broad puppy frame. But there was calculation in his steps, a focus that unsettled even the most experienced staff. The squirrel, oblivious, darted for the far corner. Shadow tensed, but did not intervene. Instead, she watched, a teacher appraising her pupil's first real test. In a sudden burst, Ranger lunged. The squirrel, startled at last, escaped by a whisker, fleeing up the wire and into the safety of the trees. Ranger stopped, panting, confusion and excitement mingling in his eyes. He looked back at Shadow, seeking approval, and for a moment, the wildcat's gaze was inscrutable, equal parts pride and caution. The implications hung heavy. Dr. Carter broke the silence. "We're raising dogs who might never be dogs again. If that puppy leaves here, who will understand what he's become?" His words echoed through the sterile room, sowing a fresh wave of anxiety among the staff. Outside, life in the den went on. That evening, Scout shadowed Shadow with a watchfulness uncanny in one so young. Pip clung to the others, his tremors less frequent, but his gaze always tracking the periphery, alert for threats only he seemed to sense. The puppies' games grew wilder, mimicking the patterns of the hunt, their play edging closer to the language of the wild than anyone had intended. For the center's team, the boundaries between wild and domestic had become perilously blurred. Reed found herself torn between awe at the puppies' adaptation and fear for their futures. The center had taken strays before, dogs and cats, even the odd raccoon, but never had an animal crossed so far into the territory of another's instincts. The debates grew sharper. One volunteer, watching a recording of Ranger's near miss with the squirrel, shook his head. "We're not just healing wounds," he said softly. "We're changing something fundamental. What happens when someone adopts these pups? What happens if they can't go back?" Reed struggled with the questions, replaying the footage late at night, searching the faces of the animals for some answer. The world outside their fences was not forgiving. Even the smallest divergence from the norm could spell disaster for creatures expected to fit tidy categories: pet or predator, wild or tame. She knew the risks, but every morning, when Shadow lay curled with the puppies pressed against her, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, the heart could reach across boundaries that reason could not. Outside, autumn crept closer. The days shortened. The wild grasses turned brittle and gold. But inside the den, the experiment, impossible, unprecedented, continued, carried on the fragile hope that love and learning might forge a new kind of family, even as the cost of that connection grew more uncertain with every passing day. Night fell early now. The forest pressed close against the center's lights, wind threading through fir branches with a sound like distant surf. The world beyond the wire faded into darkness, but inside Shadow's enclosure, the night had its own rhythm, a slow, tense ballet of alertness and longing. The puppies had grown bolder in the half-wild territory that was their home. They chased one another in clumsy circles, tails wagging, barking at Shadows. Ranger led, full of new confidence, Scout followed, sharp-eyed and careful, every step measured. Pip stayed closest to the den, his ears flicking at every sudden sound. But the wild was never far away. It was past midnight when the raccoon slipped through a breach in the outer mesh, drawn by the scent of uneaten food and the promise of warmth. The cameras caught its masked face, clever paws moving silent as smoke. For a few minutes, no one noticed. The night staff busy with a sick fawn in another building, monitors looping through their slow, monochrome footage. The raccoon was bold, hungry, and unafraid of puppies. It slunk into the den, eyes shining, teeth bared in a quiet snarl. Ranger barked, low and uncertain. Scout froze, hackles rising. Pip whimpered, body trembling as he backed away. The intruder lunged. In an instant, Shadow exploded from the shadows, a streak of muscle and fury, moving faster than any camera could follow. Her snarl ripped the silence, primal and thunderous, her claws flashing white in the cold security light. She put herself between the raccoon and the puppies, every inch of her radiating threat. The staff in the security booth startled at the sound, monitors crackling with sudden motion. By the time they focused the cameras, Shadow was standing over her adopted brood, her tail lashing, body coiled, eyes blazing in the darkness. The raccoon retreated, but Shadow wasn't satisfied. With another guttural roar, she charged, chasing the intruder up the fence and into the night. For a moment, the enclosure was still. The puppies huddled together, wide-eyed and panting. Shadow returned to them, her body trembling with adrenaline, and planted herself in front of their shaking forms. She growled, low and constant, into the empty night, sending a message the wild understood well. Whatever threatened these pups, it would have to go through her. The rescue team watched, transfixed. Dr. Reed, arriving breathless from the other building, stared at the screen with something close to awe. "She's not just tolerating them," someone whispered. "She's claiming them. She'd fight to the death for them now." It was a turning point, unmistakable and profound. The boundaries that had held the group together, discipline, distance, the cold laws of survival, were giving way to something fiercer and more enduring. For the first time, Shadow had shown what every mother in the wild must: the instinct to protect, no matter the risk, no matter the cost. Over the next days, the staff saw the change reflected in 100 small ways. Shadow grew more vigilant, circling the den at dawn and dusk, watching the sky for hawks and the brush for anything that slithered or crept. The puppies, once unruly, seemed to sense the new gravity. They moved closer to her side, pressing into her warmth, eyes flicking to her at every strange sound. Even Dr. Carter, always the skeptic, felt the weight of what was unfolding. "It's one thing to teach them how to hunt, how to survive," he muttered during a team meeting. "But this is family. This is something you can't manufacture in a lab." Still, the questions lingered, hanging heavy over the daily routines. Would Shadow's protection hold if a real threat came? Had the puppies learned too much of the wild, or not enough to keep them safe outside this fragile world? What did it mean to belong, to be claimed by a mother who wasn't your own, in a place that was never meant to be home? As October nights lengthened, the wind carried the scents of rain and distant smoke, a reminder that nothing in the wild stayed unchanged for long. But inside the enclosure, the bond had taken root, wild and unbreakable. In every snarl, every gentle nudge, every sleepless night spent guarding the den, Shadow was no longer just the wounded queen of her empty kingdom. She was a mother again. And for a little while longer, At least, nothing in the world could take that from her. Autumn pressed its gold into the leaves outside, shadows growing longer each evening as the Pacific Crest Center settled into the slow descent toward winter. Change was everywhere. The air sharper, the trees baring themselves to the sky, and inside the enclosures, a different kind of restlessness taking root. The decision, when it came, was no surprise. The puppies had thrived under Shadow's fierce discipline and protection. Their bodies were stronger, their eyes bright with the quick intelligence of survivors. But they were not bobcats. As much as they'd learned the rules of Shadow's world, there were things she could never give. The easy trust of a pack, the wordless language that passed between dogs, the safe boundaries of a home meant for family, not for wild, borrowed kin. It was Dr. Reed who voiced what everyone had begun to fear. If we wait any longer, they'll forget how to be dogs. They need their own kind. The staff, quiet and tense, agreed. Even Dr. Carter, who'd once argued for caution at every turn, nodded slowly. We owe them a chance to live a real life, not just survive and experiment. So the reintroduction began, careful, gradual, every step recorded and observed. Trainers led the puppies, one by one, out of the enclosure for longer and longer stretches. At first, just to the adjacent yard, where a trio of gentle, older Labradors waited. Ranger lunged ahead, tail high, meeting the new dogs with all the bravado of a pup who'd faced down wildcats and raccoons. Scout hung back, watchful, cautious. Pip hesitated at the threshold, looking over his shoulder as if expecting Shadow to call him back. Inside her den, Shadow paced. At first, she tolerated the puppy's absences with the stoic patience of a wild thing, nose twitching as their scent faded with each hour. But as days passed and the time away grew longer, a sharpness returned to her movements. She circled the fence, pressed her face to the ground where their paws had last touched earth, called out with low, eerie cries that rose and fell with the wind. For the puppies, each separation was its own test. The older dogs greeted them with soft, questioning growls, tails wagging, offering the strange comfort of familiarity. Ranger, always the first to adapt, responded with enthusiasm, chasing, wrestling, mimicking the games he'd half remembered from another life. Scout watched and learned, copying the other's body language, her own wild edge softening as she settled into the rhythms of play. But Pip struggled. Every return to Shadow's side was a relief, a breath released, a knot unwound. Yet even he, over time, found himself drawn to the gentle, insistent warmth of his own kind. The other dogs accepted him, licked his ears, let him sleep pressed close in a huddle of fur and breath and safety. Shadow watched it all in silence. The staff recorded her calls, low and mournful, echoing through the enclosures at dusk. More than once, Reed found her sitting at the fence line after dark, ears pricked toward the distant barks and yips, her body tense with longing and confusion. The den, once filled with restless life, seemed larger now, colder. Her movements slowed, the restless pacing giving way to long, still vigils at the edge of her world. There were setbacks. Pip refused food for 2 days after one long absence. Scout snapped at another puppy during play, the wildcat's lessons of boundaries still sharp in her mind. Ranger, in his eagerness to fit in, once growled low and rolled a stick beneath a bigger dog's paws, an echo of games he'd played with Shadow, misunderstood by his new companions. The staff intervened gently, never forcing the transitions, always giving time for the bonds to loosen, for the habits of the wild to fade. Still, the work was bittersweet. Dr. Carter wrote, "It's harder to teach them to leave than it was to teach them to stay alive." Even the most optimistic trainers found themselves lingering at the fence, searching the puppy's eyes for some sign they'd understand what was happening. For Shadow, the loss was harder to bear. She prowled the boundaries of her den, scenting for the puppies, sometimes yowling through the bars until her voice broke. At night, when all was still, the staff sometimes heard her pacing, her claws scratching patterns in the dirt, a wild elegy for the family she'd claimed and was now being asked to release. As October waned, the first frost silvered the grass. The puppies grew more accustomed to their time away, learning to find comfort in the presence of their own kind, returning to Shadow less often, each visit a little shorter, a little less urgent. Yet every farewell, every whimper at the gate, left something unfinished in the air. A longing, an ache, a bond, stretched thin, but not yet broken. For now, the den held its breath, suspended between what had been and what would come. The world beyond the fence was waiting, and for the first time, the question was not whether the wild could claim the puppies, but whether they would ever fully leave it behind. November swept in with biting winds and rain that rattled the metal roofs of the Pacific Crest Center. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, heavy with the weight of what was coming. The experiment, the bond, had reached its final test. The staff moved through their routines with the careful, subdued motions of people who knew something rare was ending. The puppies were almost unrecognizable from the frail, shivering trio found in the roadside box. Their legs were longer, their bodies lean and strong. The wild sharpness in their eyes lingered, especially in Scout's watchful gaze and the way Ranger froze at unexpected sounds, muscles taut, waiting. Pip had grown too, still smaller than his siblings but steadier now, less likely to cower behind them, more willing to follow his own path. The final separation approached with agonizing slowness. Each day, the puppies spent less time with Shadow. Trainers led them out to new yards, new playgroups, exposing them to the sights and smells of normal canine life. Human voices, rubber toys, leashes, the sound of other dogs barking, and the comfort of shared bowls and soft blankets. Ranger was the first to accept the change. He threw himself into play, tumbling with a young retriever, tail high, barking, even rolling on his back in clumsy surrender. The staff watched with quiet relief. He would adapt. He would find his place. Scout followed, but her caution never faded. She watched every move, every new dog, her body always slightly tense, her instincts still tuned to boundaries and the silent communication Shadow had taught her. But with time, she allowed herself to join the group games, edging closer, learning to trust. Pip lagged behind, still glancing toward the fence, searching for a face that didn't appear. But even he, with gentle guidance, began to share space with the others, leaning into the warmth of a new pack. And for Shadow, the emptying of the den became a living ache. She prowled the enclosure for hours, scenting every corner, calling with rough, choked sounds that faded quickly in the cold air. The staff watched her closely, worried she might spiral back into the grief that had once nearly consumed her. Dr. Reed lingered at the fence line, soft words and slow movements, careful not to intrude. She noted how Shadow's ears twitched at every distant bark, how her eyes lingered on the paths the puppies had used to come and go to. The final day came with a clear, brittle morning, frost clinging to the grass. The trainers led the puppies out, one last time, pausing to let them sniff the gate, to imprint the memory of Shadow's world on their hearts. The staff gathered, silent, as Ranger pressed his nose to the wire, tail swishing in confusion. Scout circled the edge of the gate, eyes searching for a way back. Pip sat down, shivering, not from cold, but from the tremor of goodbye. Shadow stood at the threshold of her den, watching. She did not pace. She did not snarl. For a long moment, she simply stared, her body as still and rooted as the oldest cedar. Then, as the puppies moved away, she let out a single, low cry, a sound that was neither wild nor tame, but something between, a song of longing and release. That afternoon, the puppies were officially placed in foster care, the first step to adoption. The staff wrote up careful notes, warning their new families. They are special, bright, attentive, quick to learn, but they may be different. They may startle at sudden movements or freeze at the edge of the yard, listening for something you can't hear. The transition wasn't easy, but the families understood. Ranger found a home with a retired ranger and his wife. Scout went to a teacher who spent her weekends hiking the forests. Pip, after some uncertainty, joined a family with another quiet dog, someone he could trust. For Shadow, the center made a different plan. Weeks passed before she would accept another living thing in her enclosure. But time and patience did their slow work. A male bobcat, young and strong, was introduced to the far end of her territory, always under supervision, always at a distance. At first, Shadow ignored him, her movements stiff and wary, every glance haunted by absence. But instinct and the slow thaw of loneliness worked quietly. They began to circle one another, exchanging cautious scents, each step a negotiation, a surrender to a new kind of belonging. Yet both sides, puppies and bobcat, carried scars. The bond that had formed between them did not fade easily. The puppies sometimes stopped in the yard, ears pricked, staring at the woods as if listening for a sound only they could hear. And Shadow, even as she accepted her new companion, sometimes lay awake beneath the pines, her gaze fixed on the horizon, searching for shapes that would never return. The experiment had ended. The boundaries had been restored. But the cost, and the memory of what had been possible, would not be so easily erased. In the space left behind, the staff found themselves quieter, changed, holding their own grief for a family that had never truly belonged, except for a moment, in the wild place between loss and hope. A year slipped by, marked by the slow return of green to the hills and the thawing of mountain streams. At Pacific Crest, the rhythms of life had shifted, old wounds smoothed over by time and the insistent renewal of spring. New animals arrived, others departed, and the experiment that once consumed the center's every waking thought became a story quietly shared among staff and volunteers, something wondrous, half-remembered, never quite explained. Yet, in the world outside the fences, the echoes of that improbable family lingered. Ranger, now nearly grown, his frame strong and his eyes sharp as ever, lived with Tom and Linda on the edge of the forest. He loved fetch and running beneath the tall pines, yet there was a watchfulness in him that no game could erase. One evening, as Tom hurled a tennis ball across the backyard, Ranger shot after it, muscles flowing, body stretched in a perfect arc. But halfway to the tree line, he stopped short. The ball bounced away, forgotten. Ranger stood still, nose lifted, every sense straining. In the hush that followed, a low whine rose in his throat, a sound that carried farther than any bark, thin and wild and longing. Miles away, Scout raced alongside her person, cutting trails through the woods. She'd become a dog of remarkable intuition, able to read the smallest flicker of a deer in the underbrush, or paws head-cocked, listening to the world with a concentration that awed everyone who knew her. At home, she could be restless, pacing the windows when dusk crept in, her eyes searching the darkness for secrets only she seemed to understand. Pip, quieter than the others, had found peace with a gentle family and an older dog named Mo. Some afternoons, he would sit at the yard's edge, nose pressed to the wind, as if waiting for a signal. Sometimes, for no reason his people could see, he would crouch low in the grass, utterly motionless, as though remembering a lesson written in the bones and the blood. None of the families could ever fully explain the difference. The puppies learned tricks, chased squirrels, curled up on sofas, but every so often, a wildness flashed through them, quick and bright, gone before it could be named. At the center, Shadow's world had changed too. She had allowed the young male to share her territory, at first as a stranger, then as something more. That spring, she birthed a new litter. The staff watched with cautious hope as she groomed the kittens, her tongue rough but gentle, her eyes brighter than they'd seen in months. She was a mother again, this time to her own kind, yet shaped by something she'd learned in the year of impossible bonds. One chilly morning, as Shadow washed her smallest kitten, she paused. A scent on the wind, a memory, sudden and unbidden, made her lift her head. She stared toward the horizon, ears pricked, body tense. For a moment, she held perfectly still, caught in a web of sensation, the press of warm puppy bodies, the music of unfamiliar cries, the fierce protectiveness that had remade her heart. The kitten squirmed, and Shadow blinked, returning to the present. But the memory lingered, quiet as breath, real as blood. No one else saw, but in that moment, miles away, Ranger also lifted his head, ears sharp, eyes focused on the distant ridgeline. Scout froze in the woods, and Pip, curled beside old Mo, whimpered in his sleep. Across the miles, something hummed, a thread, invisible but unbroken, connecting lives that had once shared a den against all reason, all law of nature. Dr. Reed, now a year older and changed in ways she could never quite explain, sometimes found herself pausing in the hallways, remembering. She wrote late at night, searching for language big enough to hold what she had witnessed. There are bonds that leave traces long after the world says they are gone. In the wild, in the heart, in the very blood. Sometimes what we become together cannot be undone. The world moved on. The Bobcat kittens learned to stalk and pounce, to test boundaries and trust. The puppies became dogs in the eyes of those who loved them, but the wildness would never be completely tamed. The experiment had ended, but the lesson remained. A whisper carried on wind and memory. That love once kindled can outlast separation, outlive explanation, can echo down through the years in ways none of them would ever fully understand. And so, as dusk fell and the first stars kindled above the pines, Shadow sat with her new family in the den, eyes shining in the half-light. Far off, 3 young dogs paused, each in their own way, sensing something at the edge of knowing, a call that had no words, only the echo of a bond that would never truly fade.